Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 4 Early Nationalist Responses. Rammohan Roy, Bankim Chandra, Chatterjee, Dayanand Saaraswati, and Jyotiba Phule. Let us have introduction about the unit. There are two different phases of Indian nationalism. The first one continues till the formation of the Indian National Congress in 1885, whereas nationalism in the second phase was articulated through popular mobilization around various kinds of anti imperial ideologies. Of all the competing ideologies, Gandhian non-violence was perhaps the most popular ideology in organizing anti-imperial movements in India. Unlike the second phase, when the national intervention was primarily political, the capture of state power, the first phase was largely dominated by the zeal of reform that appeared to have brought together various individuals with more or less same ideological agenda. In these kinds of activities, individuals played decisive roles in sustaining the zeal of those who clustered around them. What inspired them was perhaps the idea of European enlightenment that traveled to India simultaneously with colonialism. Drawn on the philosophy of enlightenment, neither was the British colonialism condemned nor were their attempts to expose its devastating impact on India's socio-political map in the long run. In other words, colonialism was hailed for its assumed role in radically altering the archaic socio-political networks sustaining the feudal order. It is possible to argue that colonialism in this phase did not become as ruthless as it was later. And in contrast with the past rulers, the British administration under the aegis of the East India Company seemed to have appreciated social reforms either as a matter of faith in the philosophy of enlightenment or as a strategy to infuse the Indian social reality with the values on which it drew its sustenance. With this background in view, this unit will focus on the early nationalist response to the British rule that was largely appreciated in comparison with the socio-political nature of the past rulers. Not only will there be an argument seeking to explain the uncritical endorsement of the British rule by the socially radical thinkers, but there will also be an attempt to focus on the changing nature of colonialism that also had a noticeable impact on their conceptualization of the British rule in India that became conterminous with exploitation very soon. Now let us discuss early nationalist response. Before embarking on the detailed analysis of the individual thinkers, it would be appropriate to identify the sources from which they seem to have derived their ideas in the context of an incipient colonial rule. As mentioned earlier, the first formidable influence was definitely the Enlightenment philosophy that significantly influenced the famous 1832 Macaulay Minutes. Seeking to organize Indian society in a typical Western mold, Macaulay argued for an introduction of English education and British jurisprudence for their role in radically altering the federal basis of Indian society. What was implicit in his views was the assumption that the liberal values of British variety would definitely contribute to the required social transformation in India. So, the arrival of British in India was a boon in disguise. Not only did colonialism introduce Indian to Western liberalism, but it also exposed them to the socially and politically progressive ideas of Bentham, Mill, Carlyle, and Coleridge, which drew attention to a qualitative different mode of thinking on the issues of contemporary relevance. The second equally important influence was the ideas of German philosopher Schelling, Fichte, Kant, and Herder. These ideas gained ground as the intellectual challenge against the British rule acquired momentum. In fact, there are clear traces of German ideas in Bankim's writings. Unlike Rammohan Roy, whose historical mission was to combat the social evils in the form of inhuman customs, including the sati, Bankim sought to champion the goal of freedom by drawing upon the German philosophy and Hindu past. Conceptually, the notion of work, community, and nation seemed to have inspired the early nationalists, including Bankim, presumably because they contributed to homogeneity despite differences in the context of foreign rule. So, the primary concern of the early nationalists was not uniform. For some, the introduction of the ideas of European Enlightenment was unwarranted simply because that would destroy the very basis of civilization of India that drew in a considerably way on the Hindu past. While there are others who adopted a very favorable stance vis-a-vis the English rule and its obvious social consequences. The third significant influence in the early phase of Indian nationalism was the French Revolution and its message for liberty, equality, and fraternity. Ram Mohan was swayed by the ideas that inspired the French Revolution. In his writings and deeds, Roy launched a vigorous attack on the archaic social mores, dividing India along caste and religious cleavages. For him, the priority was to create a society free from decadent feudal values. that simply stood in the way of attaining the goal of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The final source is, of course, the traditional Indian thought that was interpreted in the context of colonial rule. Not only were these writings of William Jones and Max Muller on India's rich cultural traditions, there was contributions from the Renaissance thinkers, including Vivekananda, that provided the basis for redefining India's past, closing largely the face of Muslim rule in India. Inspired by the message of Bhagavad Gita, the Renaissance thinkers supported the philosophy of action in the service of the motherland. What they tried to argue was the idea that successes or failures were not as important as the performance of one's duty with the purest of motives. Their attack on fatalism in Hinduism and Buddhist religion clearly shows how realist they were in conceptualizing the outcome of human action. For them, the life could be transformed in this world by individuals believing in the philosophy of action. So, it was not surprising that both Vivekanand and Dayanand insisted on karma or service to the humanity as the best possible way of justifying one's existence as human beings. The above discussion of sources is very useful in underlying the importance of intellectual threats in shaping the nationalist ideas of the early nationalist thinkers like Rammohan Roy, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Dayanand Saraswati, and Jyotirao Phule. It should also be mentioned here that while seeking to articulate an alternative nationalist vision, the early nationalists were influenced by the processes of socio-economic and political churning of the particular phase of British colonialism, when political articulation of freedom of the Gandhian era was a distant goal. Now, the thoughts of Ram Mohan Roy. Mohan Roy was a social thinker par excellence. His role in doing away with sati among the Orthodox Brahmins was historical. By founding Brahma Samaj, Roy sought to articulate his belief in the Islamic notion of one God. In his conceptualization, social reform should proceed. Political reform for the former laid the foundation for liberty in the political sense. Given his priority, Roy did not appear to have paid adequate attention to his political ideas. Although he despised colonialism, he appeared to have endorsed the British rule, presumably because of its historical role in combating the prevalent federal forces. Not only was the British rule superior, at least culturally, than the erstwhile federal rulers, it would also contribute to a different India by injecting the values it represented. His admiration for the British rule was based on his faith in its role in radically altering traditional mental makeup of the Hindus. The continued British rule, he further added, would eventually lead to the establishment of democratic institutions as a Great Britain. Like any other liberals, Roy also felt that the uncritical acceptance of British liberal values was probably the best possible means of creating democratic institutions in India. In other words, he appreciated the British rule as a boon in disguise because it would eventually transplant democratic governance in India. The other areas for which the role of Rammohan was decisive was the articulation of demand for the freedom of press. Along with his colleagues, Dwarkanath Tagore, he submitted a petition to the Privy Council for the freedom of press, which he justified as essential for democratic functioning of the government. Not only would the freedom of press provide a device for ventilation to grievances, it would also enable the government to adopt steps for their redressal before they caused damage to the administration. Viewed in the liberal mold, this would be a remarkable step in that context for two reasons. First, the demand for freedom of press was a significant development in the growing, though limited, democratization among the indigenous elite in India. And second, the idea of press freedom, if sanctioned, would act as a safety valve for the colonial ruler because of exposition of grievances in the public domain. Rammohan Roy had played a progressive role in a particular historical context. While conceptualizing his historical role, Roy appeared to have privileged his experience of British colonialism over its immediate feudal past. By undermining the obvious devastating impact of foreign rule on Indian society, politics, and economy, he also clearly supported one system of administration over the other rather consciously, simply because of his uncritical faith in British Enlightenment in significantly transforming the prevalent Indian mindsets. One may find it difficult to digest his invitation to the British planters in India, despite their brutalities and ruthlessness vis-a-vis the Indian peasants if discussed in isolation. But this was perfectly nationalized if one is drawn to his argument justifying the continuity of the empire on the basis of its economic strength. The more the planters acquire wealth, argued Roy, the better would be their defense for continuity in India. Given his historical role, it would not be wrong to argue that Raman Rai discharged his responsibilities in tune with the historical requirements of his role in the particular context of India's growth as a distinct socio-political unit. It would therefore be historically inaccurate to identify him as pro-empirical thinker, simply because nationalism did not acquire the characteristics of the later period. His ideas, whether supporting the British or criticizing the past rulers, were both historically conditioned and textured. He authored his historical role in the best possible way, reflecting the dilemma of the period and the aspiration of those grouping for an alternative in the social and political doldrums of incipient colonialism. Now we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.